Hello everyone, and welcome to this webinar where we're going to be looking at best practices for each stage of a CLM implementation. And I am very pleased to be welcoming Skip Walter, who's the Vice President of Contract Lifecycle Management at software provider Conga. Conga doing some great things in the market, Skip, and certainly we've been hearing a lot of positive news back from our members about the offering that you have brought to the market. So very much looking forward to hearing your views and update as we go forward today.
Thank you, Tim. I'm delighted to be here, and we really appreciate the opportunity to talk about contract lifecycle management and how to think about implementation. So really appreciate it.
So if we can get started on our slide deck, I think probably the message from me comes briefly at the beginning before I hand over to Skip. And I mean, I think, and from the numbers of people attending this webinar and others we've been running in our series around automation, it is very clear that the community, whether in procurement, sales contracting, legal, etc., really do recognize the growing importance and relevance of automation, not just generally within their businesses, where of course digitization is high on pretty much every corporate agenda, but specifically within the contracting space. And there have been many reasons, and we've of course documented those and done research on them, many reasons why organizations have either been hesitant to automate contracting or perhaps have been disappointed with the results they achieved. New emerging technologies, as I'm sure you're going to hear again today, are really turning this on its head. It's not only the fact that the new technologies are beginning to create much more capability around contracting, but it's also the growing impatience that there is on the part of many executives that this is an area that really remains relatively unreformed, relatively untouched by meaningful technology. So it is without question an opportunity for all of us. Let's just go forward, and I want to talk a little bit about the process and a viewpoint, I suppose, that we have at ICCM about the process. I think one of the challenges that we have is that still in many organizations, actually the contracting life cycle is a fairly fragmented array of activities. It clearly has multiple stakeholders, which makes it complicated, and definitely makes it complicated for people like you, Skip, to work out who to sell to. But it also is complicated, of course, in the sense that very often the activities are relatively fragmented. The responsibility is not always entirely clear. And I wanted, therefore, to just introduce these two slides just to generate that thinking, that recognition. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, but obviously there is an operational aspect, a framework setting, if you like. Contracts do not just magic themselves from nowhere. There is an underpinning process through which contract structures and individual terms and conditions are, of course, established, but also a process which should be creating clarity of responsibilities, authorities, etc. So there is this background capability creation around good contracting. One of the interesting questions, of course, is increasingly, so where is technology playing in these areas? And some areas of this, it's fairly obvious, but with emerging technology, as I'm sure Skip will begin to allude to, there are actually many, many more different opportunities in this area. So moving on from there, what about at the transactional level? Well, this I think will be much more familiar to all of us, and obviously an area we think about, or aspects we think about on a daily basis. But again, as many of you will be aware, the roles and responsibilities at these different phases are often very different groups of people. Very often, of course, different functional groups. It may be relatively unclear in many cases exactly who does what. It's certainly rarely clear as to who is really accountable for the overall quality and integrity of what's happening in this process. And that, of course, again, has made automation difficult, but it's also made it of critical importance, because the more we can streamline in this area, the more, of course, we are in a position to add tremendous value to the business. So my sort of conclusion on all of this before I pass over to Skip is absolutely we have a phenomenal opportunity at this point around that streamlining of process to either respond to senior management with its current frustration or to highlight to them the scale of business and financial opportunity that really comes from this. And we're going to be talking about multiple aspects of that in the presentation from Skip, where I think he's also going to ask me once or twice to give some comments as we move along. So with that, Skip, let me pass through to you.
Thanks, Tim. Really appreciate the opportunity to talk about something that's near and dear to my heart, both as a software developer and as one who has had to both generate and sign way too many contracts over my 50 years in the software development space. So I think what we want to talk about today is what can effective contract management do for your business. And I really like to emphasize the word business in that piece. These are some of the attributes of what we can do and what several of the vendors in this space are doing, as well as the importance of having good professional services, whether inside or outside the organization. And I think IACCM has been talking about for quite a while the notion of contract management maturity. And Tim, would you like to say a few words about CMM and IACCM?
Yes, thank you, Skip. Yeah, well, again, I guess we go back to the point I made that, as you rightly say, we undertake dozens of capability maturity assessments for member organizations each year. And the challenge for most is the difficulty of orchestrating across those multiple stakeholders. This isn't a nice, clean, clear area in the way that some other business processes, say in finance or whatever may be. So the importance really of thinking through that maturity. Now, I suppose the good news, Skip, is that certainly repositories these days are pretty common. I think it's it's the rest of it that is often still probably a challenge for many organizations. And particularly, and I think this is, again, where senior management is getting more and more interested, is around the quality and the value that can be driven through better reporting and analytics. It's around that opportunity for continuous improvement, for driving greater quality of performance in the business. We are seeing and hearing more and more, for example, about the way that insights from the contracting process can dramatically reduce the cost of overall commercial operations. And of course, it does that in part through better understanding of when is it worthwhile, for example, to negotiate? What is the real value generated by that negotiation? Do we have clarity and consistency of workflow? And of course, the answer is often we do not. And those, of course, give multiple opportunities to really think about better integrations so that you've got higher quality of data flows and people who need information have access to it. And then, of course, ultimately, that continuing journey of optimization. Optimization, not just, of course, of the contract, but more importantly, of the business results, particularly the financial results that actually underpin whether or not a contract can be deemed successful or not.
Thanks, Tim. I wanted to start out today with a notion I came across a couple of years ago, which is the study of service systems and service system science. I had the privilege of participating in some National Science Foundation seminars with a wonderful group of academics and large corporations like IBM. And I ended up sitting next to gentleman by the name of Jim Sporer, who is head of all the cognitive systems research at IBM. And he turned around and he said, so what do you think about system science or services science? And I went, I don't know, never heard of it. And that started a journey over the last couple of years to really dive deeply into what's the notion of service systems. Because today, most of the really interesting processes in a corporation are the combination of tools, products, and services. Those services oftentimes provided through the people and the human systems. And so the three things that, if there's three things to take away from this presentation and think about best practices, it's thinking about your contract lifecycle management as a service system, number one. Number two, that it's all about value co-creation. It's about value co-creation with the vendors that are supplying the tools for you, and it's about value co-creation for those of you implementing these systems with your business units, and it's about value co-creation with your business units with either their customers or their suppliers. And lastly, the third piece of this summary is configurations. And I think that's one of the biggest things we've been focused on is configuration, not customization. Is we've seen the nature of contract lifecycle management. It's always changing. We'll talk about some of the regulations, what things you control, what things are out of your control that you need to respond to. So this very simple matrix that can be thought of as a 2x2 or also can be looked at down below as a sequence is how do I combine my human system and my tool system? Well, when we start with any new business process, it's typically a collaboration of the professionals within inside the organization. Then we start bringing in tools to augment the human beings in that system. As we have experience with those tools, we then start delegating or possibly outsourcing as we have service level agreements, as we have guardrails around the processes. So we're seeing that in the last several years with what folks have talked about as the third wave of contract lifecycle management, which is moving into the sales force. As we're able to build guardrails around the processes, we can delegate some parts of the contracting process to the folks that are on the front line. And lastly, as many folks in the consumer areas have found, we can automate the whole process, go to self-service, so the end customer can generate their contract, if you will, without the need for expensive human beings in that process. Now, some people look at this and say, oh, you're trying to automate me out of a job. No, it's not so much that. It's we've got hundreds of these processes, even within contract lifecycle management. And it's about picking those processes that we can drive through the process and not get stuck in any one state and then recycle and find the next process within our contract lifecycle management system. So it's really about how do I put these four pieces together and think through and drive through. So if you have some interest, some of the most detailed research is in the handbook of the service science, but there's a different twist on it, which is a recent book called Value as a Service, is thinking through not delivering from our standpoint or from the vendor standpoint just a blob of software and throwing it over the fence. How do we deliver real value in this co-creation, and how do we make sure that not just the implementation group, but the business folks and your customers' customers are receiving value as a service too? This is an excellent book to look at one piece of the puzzle of an important business process, but it's thinking about how do we all in this service system deliver value to our customers and our customers' customers. There's another piece of this puzzle which is about making users awesome. And there's this wonderful little diagram in the book about oftentimes we want to have a larger context. So I might have a larger context in a simple form of how do I make great presentations. So I buy a book, I look at some data visualization software, I may need a spreadsheet app, I want to find some Photoshop and stock photos, I want to find maybe a PowerPoint tool, and the next thing I know, while I started out to make a great presentation, I'm focused down in the weeds with all these tools and lost in the process, and it may take me a long time to come up to the reason I wandered into getting these tools was to make great presentations. We see a lot of the same thing with customer contract lifecycle management, which is that one of the first things you do is, okay, we need a contract lifecycle management. We may have a hazy idea of what we need, and then we immediately start looking at the tools and we start looking at training, and we forget that what we're trying to do is make all of the users of the system better so that we can drive better outcomes for the business. And sort of the second key piece in here is I have a difficult time reminding my product managers and those folks in our professional services organization and working with system integrators is, yes, we have to bring all of these tools together, but it's really about the business outcomes we're trying to reach. The features and tools are a means to the end. Let's not lose sight of what it is that we're trying to do. So as we look at the 5 stages of a CLM implementation, we can see that we have at one level sort of the ideal example, and we talked about this earlier in another form, which is the contract management maturity model. So how do we do planning, research, creating a business case, implementation, and rollout, and continued optimization? So I want to talk briefly about each of these. Excuse me. And one of the ones that I think gets missed in the process and oftentimes gets obscured with formal requests for proposals, RFP processes, is there's 2 different ways of planning. And Bob Biller at USC laid this out a number of years ago. We have bedrock planning. It has the attributes of you know where you are, you know where you're going, and you know how to get there. And then there's swamp mode planning, which is you don't really know where you are because you're oftentimes in the middle of a complex organization. You're not sure where you're going, i.e. you're not sure what the right goals are, and you don't necessarily know how to get there. And depending on the environment, when you do your assessment of where your organization is, one or the other of these processes might be the better path. And that's one of the first things in terms of getting to understand where the company is. Simplistically, in a bedrock situation, what you do is you save up all of your changes, you make them all at once, and then you bring the system back to normal. In a swamp mode planning, it's one of you almost do it backwards. You sort of do a little experiment, see how that experiment works, and then move on to the next experiment. In the software development world, bedrock is what we call waterfall methodology, and swamp mode is what we call agile. So one of the things to think about as you're looking at your overall contract management life cycle is which parts of the processes are really bedrock, they have to be this way, and which are more in the swamp mode where you can get started early and experiment. So one of the first things that we recommend is really using either an internal or an external consultant. How do you understand and document your pain points? How do you sort out where your bottlenecks and your hassles are? Adrian Slowatsky's done a very interesting, simple little white paper on hassle maps, which is just a simple way of looking at your workflows and where's the friction in your workflows. Where are the places where there's hassles and where's the biggest hassle? And then as you look at all of this, you feel duty-bound to go solve everything and optimize everything. But one of the first things to do, and a good consultant will do this with you, is find the difference that will make the greatest difference and then figure out how to start there. And one of the second bullet point here is to really make sure that the people who benefit from the project are identified and involved. When we've done studies, which we'll talk about in a minute, this is where we see that projects that don't do as well as the projects that succeed are ones that don't really involve all of the people who are involved in the process. And then thinking about a service system of what's the correct arrangement of tools and processes and expertise, what pieces will stay human, what pieces will become automated, how do you really want to configure that? And then, of course, 2 things is making sure you have an executive sponsor so that you feel comfortable that you're going to have continuity in terms of the funding over the course of the entire project. Then there's the research phase, and one part of the research phase is understanding what existing or upcoming regulations are going to affect you. And Tim, would you like to share a bit on that?
Indeed, thank you. Yes, well, of course, most of us are well aware that the stream of regulation that impacts all of us is apparently unending, and if anything, continues to increase. And of course, depending on what industry we're in, there are some that are very industry specific, but others, such as these on the chart here, that of course are very generic. This is putting remarkable pressure on organizations. When we talk about friction points, I mean, this is obviously, these are all areas that require careful thought and evaluation. The new financial regulations, for example, that require us to rethink revenue recognition and to consider the impact of our terms and conditions on the ability to take revenue, has brought, yet again, an area of analysis and thinking into the contracting area, which is brand new. If we switch across and think instead about things like GDPR, and I'm sure many of you are hearing about that. Of course, it comes into effect in less than 2 months now, and is really remarkable in terms of the onerous nature of GDPR. We've been going through it here at ICCM, so I can speak about that as a matter of authority. The thing is, where do all of these play in contracting? Clearly, it's not enough simply to put terms and conditions into our contract. The implications of much of this is also about continuous monitoring, showing diligence, and of course the risks associated with quite a number of these areas are to corporate reputation, and as a result to corporate bottom line. And if you don't believe me, just ask Mark Zuckerberg. So I think all of this is obviously, again, placing more and more emphasis on the issue of the integrity of contracting, and it's also emphasizing the fact that it has now really moved outside the domain of human capability to adequately manage. The monitoring, the control, the insurance of ensuring that appropriate terms have been passed through, that amendments have been done, etc., etc. All of these records, the regulators increasingly expect us to have fully automated, fully visible. So I guess, Skip, if for no other reason, probably this pressure of regulation is just forcing many organizations to go down the automation route.
Thanks, Tim. And one of the reasons I was delighted to join Conga is I was part of a company a couple of years ago where we had a very large contract come in, and we spent 3-4 months negotiating the contract. We had everybody on our side and their side, signed the deal, so that we could recognize all of the revenue at once. And then about a month later from support, I got a call to sit there and send a bunch of folks to France. And I said, time out, we just signed the contract and we agreed that we would fix things in next release. Well, turns out a salesperson sat there and did a sidebar email message that said we would send people on site whenever we needed. That caused us to have to changed the revenue recognition, and our stock tanked by about half. We lost 50% of our value at the time. And so that's one of the reasons I wanted to go into this space, is to provide systems so that hopefully other companies never have to experience what we went through in that company. So along with the regulations, what else affects your organization? And I think it's key here is really the second question is what is in your control and what's not? What kinds of things can you do within your organizations? What are you going to be allowed to do? Who's going to be in control of it? How do multiple departments work together? And what are your standard pieces of functionality? The workflows, how are the contracts going to be created and negotiated, as Tim talked about earlier? And then what kind of functionality do you want to make sure that you can have? Advanced analytics, clause management, machine learning, and AI are big topics today. And we're quite excited about some of the things that we're going to be delivering in the near future in that area. It's just a whole set of things as we go down the planning stages and the optimizations and get to where we can implement, that these kind of capabilities show up. So which kind of capabilities do you need at the beginning, particularly the repository? And then how is the value going to show up at each stage? And I think that's one of the other key pieces as we think here is when you're looking at business outcomes, it's not just the outcome after you spent a year implementing all of this, it's how can you have business outcomes each step of the way? And what kinds of things can you do to experiment on some of that before going through a lengthy RFP process? What can you get going now? And I love the kind of outcome frame notion when you're thinking about this type of planning and research is, what is it you want to create? That's your vision, that's your mission, that's your business outcomes. But then the second piece are the metrics. How will you know that you created it? What do you want to create and how will you know that you've created it? And then this is where it's so important to create the internal business case. And one of the things that's interesting is, we'll see here in a second as we talk about enterprise contract lifecycle management, is contracts work on both sides of, if you will, the buy side and the sell side. So as we're buying things into the corporation, as we're selling things to other corporations, but it's also those internal contracts. So employment contracts, NDAs, all of those things that we have for those people that we work with. What's the business case? And so looking at both the qualitative outcomes and the quantitative business outcomes. Do you have a clear metric, and is the metric measurable enough so that on a daily or weekly basis you can see your progress against that metric? Project management is key, and we'll see in a minute it's not just any project manager, but a project manager that has experience in the whole contract lifecycle makes for much more successful projects, if you will. You want to have your planning and timeline. How are you going to do your resource management? That resource is both the human and the technical systems, making sure you're aligned with your IT folks as you go through the process. And then look at both efficiencies and effectiveness. And effectiveness, particularly in the form of your customers. How would your customers be rating your effectiveness? And then we emphasize it several times here, but the importance of executive sponsorship. And it's not just saying that I've got somebody that's above me that's paying attention, but somebody that's going to ask the right business questions and put things into the business context for you so you can make your business case. Outcome metrics. It's interesting when I sit down with this, you can have your metrics disguised 100 different ways, but fundamentally they're going to be some form of better, faster, cheaper, or they're going to be some form of increased revenue and decreased costs. But there's another piece here, which, because we're looking at human systems and technology systems, is Slowatsky's imperatives for knowledge worker productivity. And this is another set of metrics to help you think and plan how you really want your contract lifecycle management to work. So you want to move from guessing what customers want to know to knowing their needs. Tim in past webinars has talked about a telecoms company that didn't just implement what they had, but went all the way to understanding and segmenting their different customers and then setting up a contract process that works for each type of customer. Make sure that's part of your system and part of your metrics. How do we get information, move from getting information in lag time, that is, it's available weeks from now, to the importance of having dashboards. I can see what's going on in real time. I can see the contracts flowing through the system and what's stuck, what's moving, how much does that change my revenue position, that sort of thing. And then for your human system, the people that are going to be using the system, is how do we get them moving away from low value work, copying and pasting from here to there, doing the interminable spreadsheet, copying, pasting in a spreadsheet, and doing things that may be useful for the person who created the spreadsheet but are difficult for the rest of us to make sense of, to how do we gain high talent leverage, particularly how do we do more with less, and a lot of that is taking the low value work and putting it into the system. On the implementation, sorry, go ahead.
If I may, I love that last slide. I think it's really one that requires significant reflection. I know that many of our members tend to struggle with this question of what really is the ROI of contract management automation. And of course, traditionally, so much automation has really been about saving headcount within the affected function. But in the contract management space, that really is a waste of time. I mean, the number of lawyers you're going to reduce, the number of contract managers you're going to reduce, for most companies, it is not enough to justify the implementation. And of course, here you've got such a multitude of things. Decreased costs is one, but of course those costs are going to come from many, many other parts of the business, and they are going back to the point you made earlier, which I think is such an important one. If you want to really look at the outcome metrics, test those friction points. You know, one of the members been working with recently, the frequency with which invoices are wrong, the frequency with which there's disagreement over the scope, the statement of work. These are the sorts of areas where you can really begin to look at how can I drive greater quality into my processes to save not a few $100,000, but literally many, many millions of dollars.
Thanks, Tim. And if I were to add a whole bunch of things to this, I would also talk about some metrics that come from the manufacturing world, but are really important in any kind of life cycle process, which is what's the cycle time? What's the calendar time? How long are things sitting in our different states within the organization? Because each time there's a delay, there's either on the buy side, we're not getting the tools in that we need to increase our cost position or potentially increase the revenue, or on the sell side, we're not getting the revenue on the sales side. So each of these things, these are sort of the generic pieces, but now thinking through in terms of your own unique organization, these provide a good starting point to say, okay, what here can we do better, faster, or cheaper? And my favorite is, okay, what are the ways in which we can increase revenue? So thanks. Implementation and rollout. This is where folks like ICCM and other customers, I think it's really is, we look at the importance of bringing customers together on a regular basis. This is where so much of the learning occurs, and where we can, while nobody likes to talk about necessarily their failures, if you will, that's where I've found over the years that I learn the most is from the things that don't go well, less so from when they do go well. And if I was involved when things go well, then of course it was because I'm brilliant, but where the real learning is when things don't go well. And Preferred Hotels, which is a case story that's up on our website, they were a good example of, they started with, okay, we need to do the repository and then we need to get to the reporting. And they had one set of goals, but once they did the reporting, they all sat there and were just drop-jawed, slack-jawed when they found that they had $800,000 in missed billings over a couple of years. So all of a sudden, this system that they put in for one purpose, by having the ability to have a repository and reporting, they quickly found out they had been missing a large amount of their billings, and they were able to go back and recover most of that $800,000, which paid for the system pretty much immediately. I think the second thing in terms of driving the business benefit and the importance of starting with outcomes is always to be assessing. How are we doing with our planning on one side and delivering? And on the other side, are we accomplishing the business goals? If not, why not? Did we have the wrong business goal in the first place? Did we have the wrong outcome? Make sure that we switch the outcome, and oftentimes the things we find can lead to better outcomes than where we started. And certainly from an Agile standpoint, one of the pieces here is which pieces of the process do you really not understand? And an example of that is, are you putting in a contract lifecycle management system to essentially just move your current way of doing things, or can you really take advantage of the new way of doing things? And this is where the swamp mode planning or the agile approach is to do some experiments, to sit there and find out quickly whether something will work or not in a pilot environment. And then again, this be looking both at efficient and effective. Many folks start by thinking about the reducing costs and being efficient, but there's a real opportunity, particularly as we move into the sell side, to do effective implementations and have a different level of effectiveness with your customers. So this is just a reminder of what we talk about in terms of the customer, the buy side, and the sell side. And as we look at this and think about it, every contract has both. It just depends on which side you're viewing things from. But it's really about, when you think about the vendors and the tools, it's about the integrations. So what we think is really important is on the sell side, the integrations you do should be in the place where the salesperson is living. So whether that's Salesforce or Microsoft Dynamics or other CRM systems, it's important that the user interface be what the user is used to on a daily basis. Same way on the buy side, that it's what's the system that people are used to living in, and then make sure the system supports that kind of user interface. And then in both cases, are we taking the data out of the documents, out of the deal, and making sure they go to the right system of record? So here's an example. We did a study a couple months ago on the sell side implementations and looked at about 40% of our customers. And this is what we found with those folks who were successful very quickly and those folks who weren't. You just go down this list and can see that all of the things that were absent or somebody was new to on the low success side, by low success side meaning it was taking them a long time to achieve any kind of outcome. And on the right-hand side, we can see the importance of having particularly all the stakeholders defined, and in a couple of places here, the importance of domain experts. And this is where a lot of times we think with project managers, their expertise isn't particularly important other than can they, quote, manage a project, versus having domain expertise in the contract lifecycle and understanding both the buy and the sell side. So this is, from our standpoint, reinforces the importance of having really understanding it's a service system that you're building, and a number of both human systems and technical systems need to come together in order to provide the success of the project. Now, I think the so-called nirvana is when we can do the continued optimization. And this is where once the system is in place, once we've gone through the maturity stages and we have the reporting, and we now have the interfaces, we have the dashboards, now how are we moving our system forward and what can we optimize? And this is another way of, once we have the system up and running, there's probably a different set of bottlenecks and hassles that have showed up with our human system and technology system. How do we find those new bottlenecks and those new hassles and map those? One of the things that many of the customers that we talk to, many of the prospects we talk to, talk about the importance of having external audits. So this is, again, the external, either external consultants or external people who have not been an active part of the project within your organization, to come in on a regular basis, at least quarterly, oftentimes a shorter meeting on a monthly basis, to provide that external view, to ask the questions, the hard questions often are what I like to talk about when I show up is I'm optimally ignorant, so I'm going to be asking questions and go into my Columbo routine, if you will. But the importance of having that audit and having it from a set of folks who are both internal and external. And then, are you actively managing your system? Are you paying attention to new technologies that you might be able to add to your system? Are you paying attention to new processes? Are you paying attention to other customers through customer advisory groups, that sort of thing? Are you paying attention to what IACCM is providing? Are you paying attention to what the different analysts are talking about as to what are best practices? And then, are you keeping your own best practices within your system? So what is working for you in your own unique situation? And that's what's oftentimes difficult to talk about best practices is each corporation I've found over the years is unique. We can find some patterns, and hopefully we can find a lot of patterns so that we can build our software. But at the end of the day, it's a combination of your unique processes, your unique competitive position, and your enterprise CLM. So this is another way of, as you think about interacting with your vendors, oftentimes we see these RFPs that have question after question that are details about the functionality. But another thing that's important is to really understand what the vendor's strategy, those folks who are providing your tools. So are they going past the first and second wave, or have they stayed stable in terms of they put out a set of functionality and they're doing continuous improvement, but not really making leaps in terms of what's needed in getting to the optimization, what's needed to get to automation of some of the contract processes. Are you doing both sides of contract lifecycle management, both integrations with your ERP systems as well as integrating to your CRM? Are you working both the buy and the sell side? And I think one of the things that we talk about is the importance of the data that's in the document as well as the document itself. And we saw an interesting observation the other day, the 90-10 when it comes to a contract is 10% of the information in the contract is about the deal and is about the value, the direct value of the contract. And the other 90% of the language in the contract is for when things go wrong. And in those things that go wrong, there's still some things that you can pull out in terms of data about your contract and the implications, not just for the value of the contract on the revenue side, but the risk profile that your organization is taking on. So part of the data and the risk that we're doing is terms of how are your vendors helping you do that, and what are the kinds of reporting, analytics, and optimization that your vendors are helping you with. And then how do we sit there and look at now beyond a single contract and look at all of the contracts that are live at a given point and being able to make both better deal-making practices, but also give you a better idea of the health of your revenue, the health of your company on both the supply side and the demand side. And you want to sit there and look at where are your vendors, if you will, and where are your system integrators investing their time? Are they just focused on workflow, or are they focused on all of the things here in the middle, which is speed to value? That's something that we look at with each of our products, which is how long does it take from when the customer installs our software to when they're able to receive value from it. And that's changed the nature of how we think and build our products. And we're quite excited again about some of the things that we're already doing in terms of entity recognition within a document, pulling out that data, and then where do we map that data to in our systems of record. So it's recognizing what are the key pieces of data in a contract, and then where do we put it in terms of the systems of record. And every time a contract is changed, we update the system of record. Then analytics both for the revenue and cost side, as well as thinking about the risk factors. So as an example of that middle bucket, one of the things that emerged and we heard from our customers that we announced just recently is people wanted an easy e-signature solution that's right in the middle of Salesforce and ties to our products as opposed to having to go to external kinds of products. So this is the kind of thing you're looking for. Are your vendors working with you on the technology systems to help your human systems paying attention to where your hassles are? So I think this is another way of looking at the metrics, but this focus on business outcomes and business results is where are you in terms of the velocity of what you're looking to do. And velocity can be thought of how quickly can you get useful value to your stakeholders with a CLM implementation. How visible is the data? How visible are the deals? How visible are the contracts to the people that need to know within the organization? And then making sure that you still have control in the right places. So even though you may, or even as you move capabilities so that a salesperson can do contracts that you have the appropriate guardrails in place, and that they can only do the kind of things that you allow them to do. So velocity, visibility, control. And then lastly here is just back to the first thing, which is the 3 real points here. Service systems, thinking about your CLM implementation and everything that you do as a combination of a human system and a tool system, and all of the sub-processes that are within the service system. How quickly can you move from the collaborate, the human system, working with each other, into the automation once you understand what's really needed and what are the right things that can help you on the augment and the delegate. And again, the delegate can be all the way out to the customer essentially generating their self-service model, or it can be an internal organization like sales. So service systems, value co-creation, and can I easily configure and reconfigure my system as my environment changes, either internally or externally as we work with regulations, and do I have a collection of vendors that can work with me on that? So really appreciate your time today, and thank you. And now we have a little bit of time for questions. And on the question side, some of them we may be able to answer now. And those that we can't, we will get back to you.
Yes, thank you, Skip. Yes, do please keep sending in your questions. I'm sure there are quite a number out there, so good moment to get whatever insight or knowledge you need. Skip, one of them, how realistic is it to think of a single CLM for both buy side and sell side?
We certainly believe it's very realistic. I think that that's why oftentimes you have, or in our case, we have what looks like 2 different systems, but that's the nature of the integration on both sides, is typically the human talent working on the sell side has a very different user interface that they expect and a different set of things that they integrate with than on the buy side. Typically the buy side is more also traditional Word-like capabilities. The other thing that we're seeing, and we're delighted to announce with our recent, us personally, with the recent acquisition of Octave, is we're seeing the nature, particularly on the sell side, of the documents that we deal with, the contract artifacts, if you will, moving from document-based artifact, typically page-based artifacts, to web page or HTML5-based artifacts. So we're going to be seeing changes like that in terms of how dynamic the environment is and who's going to be creating the document. But they are conceptually 2 different integrations that happen on the 2 different sides, and that's where we see the big differences. And then do you have a user interface that's tailored for each of those environments? So we certainly are doing that as a company. Others are doing that as well. But what you don't want to do is have one side or the other be forced into the user interface and the system of record of the other. You have to deal with both.
Another question. Typically, what sort of cycle time should be expected for implementation of a system?
That one's all over the map. I think it depends on whether you're starting with the sell side or the buy side, or you're trying to do both at the same time. And it differs, you know, from the form of, we've had folks who've been able to, in a month or 2, bring up a sell side implementation. There's some folks that have been able to do that on the buy side, but typically the buy side, there's more integrations that you have to go to, and so that's what takes the length of time. The software itself is pretty straightforward. The big piece of the puzzle is how you're going to get your contract information in, and are you just going to move your legacy contracts into the system, into a repository, or are you going to adapt your contracting process to what the new technologies allow you to do? If it's more the latter, this is where you're going to typically take longer time, but that's also moving to new technologies. that's where experimentations and being a little bit agile versus trying to do everything at once, I think, can be most valuable for folks.
Skip, I'm going to ask you this question because I did actually ask the questioner, Tina, to just re-express it, which she has done, but I'm still not quite sure that I understand it. So I'm going to test it on you and give you the opportunity to either appear incredibly smart or like me appear incredibly dumb. So in terms of the ERP system chosen by a business, how much of a factor is customer compatibility and ease of use? And from your experience, would a proportion of costs be passed on to the customer or suppliers? I'm not quite sure where it's going, or I'm assuming it's sort of referencing Ariba type systems, for example, where obviously there is a cost pass through. I certainly can't imagine that one would ever get away with a cost pass through to a customer, but any thoughts on that question?
That's one I would love to get back to you on, because it's, I mean, what's hard about that question is obviously you've got to, in the general case, you've got to take your costs and pass them on to either customers or suppliers in some fashion. That's sort of the cost of doing business. But to charge it at a transactional rate, I certainly haven't seen a lot of people doing that, and I'd have to think about that, or I'd have to get back to you on that one. The experience is it's a cost of doing business, and what you're looking for is typically trying to, in the way you price your product, whether it's by users or types of users or roles of users, it's more that way versus kind of the transaction model, if you will.
So Harvey poses an interesting question, and I suspect the answer to this really is a little bit, it depends, but the question, what are best practices to initiate a new contract into the system? Is it the stakeholder, the contracts team, or somewhere else?
I'm sorry, Tim, I missed the first part of that question.
What are best practices to initiating a new contract into the system? Is it the stakeholder, the contracts team, or somewhere else?
Wonderful question from a couple of different directions. So yeah, the it depends is, and I think the other answer is both. I think when done well, and this was your telecoms example from a previous example, the easiest way is to have your contracts team put the contract up into the system and take your experience, and then typically if you have a system that has a contract playbook that has the fallback clauses and that sort of thing, put that into the system. I think where the stakeholder comes in and the involvement there is, what is it that, can you find the patterns in who the audience is for a particular contract, and then tailor things so that there's less and less friction in terms of having to negotiate with that particular customer. And that's where I think, what are the business goals, what are we trying to achieve, and what hassles are we trying to eliminate? And so that's where I think you would put both parties together to understand you've got the right business goal.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I guess I go back to the quadrants that you identified a couple of times with the slide that you introduced, you know, that led from collaboration to automation. And of course, you know, the opportunity here is to automate, but you can only automate if you've provided sufficient guidance and intelligence out to that front-end stakeholder. So it's not just, of course, a question of whether they are perhaps answering the right questions to get the right specific terms and term options, but it may also be a question of them ensuring that they get the right overarching template or relationship type. We recently did work with one of our members. We reviewed several thousand contracts, and we found that over 50% of them had actually used the wrong template. So there's a lot of intelligence that needs to be moved out into the business to enable that sort of self-service world. And it's absolutely, as you're saying, it's one of those big opportunities to take out a cost, delay, and friction point. Can Conga software integrate with an integrated financial management information system?
So we have, particularly with the Conga Contracts product, formerly known as Novatus. On the Novatus side, definitely we have done integrations to financial systems. We're also working, starting some partnerships with some system integrators that focus on financial systems, and they will be adding to our capabilities there.
Probably our final question, to what extent do you see artificial intelligence changing the nature of the product and its capability?
We see it changing a lot, and I'll expand. When we talk about artificial intelligence, we also include machine learning. And so we see a great deal of things that we can do, particularly in areas. So I mean, we're already doing quite a bit in our whole, what we call true up capability, which is to take a contract, whether it's been generated in our system or it's third-party paper that comes in, and find the fields that need to go into the system of record. And so we've looked at you know, the nice part of just having done millions of contracts is finding all the different ways, different fields, different pieces of data are called. That's the entity recognition part, and then finding the value, and then mapping that to the system of record. So it sounds relatively straightforward, but it's a real interesting challenge that requires some good training sets in order to do the entity recognition and entity attribution. I think we're going to be seeing some tools in the near future that do contract type recognition. So part of putting a lot of the metadata around setting up your repository, getting all the information, getting all the fields, what kind of contract is this, what kind of clause is here, be able to generate automatically the model of those contracts that you already have, or if again you get third-party paper in from somebody else, how does that go together? So that's just the tip of the iceberg of things that we see with artificial intelligence and machine learning that will be in our product environment, certainly in the relatively near future. So I mean, key bit is we're already doing it. We see a lot of promise. We're investing in this area quite heavily, and is very personally one of the things why I was excited to join Conga is when I understood the vision and the roadmap, and that the AI and the machine learning was a key part of that.
Skip, indeed, I think it is very exciting times. I think for many of our members, we understand absolutely the operational challenges they're under of finding time to try and think forward and really understand where the future may be leading us. But we, of course, do all that we can to try and help our members get those sort of answers. And I know that you're absolutely on top of it as well. I think the opportunities, as I said at the beginning, for the community in terms of the role of contracting and the quality of data and information that comes from it, and the scale of business value and change that can actually be driven through more intelligence, more data generation from the contracting process is phenomenal. So we are, of course, out of time. Thank you very much, Skip, and thank you very much to our audience for your questions. There were a few questions not answered, but Skip, I know you've got access to those, so I'm sure you'll be getting back to those people. And again, thank you very much to you and to Conga for being with us today.
Thank you, Tim. We really appreciate the opportunity, and we thank IACCM for all the good work that you're doing in helping us all understand where we need to be headed.
Well, I wish I knew the answer to that one. Thank you. Goodbye, everybody.